Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and it's the final of our year-end list. The top 50 best albums of 2022. I've talked before about how this particular final year-end list always feels a little like a professional obligation, where I hadn't already submitted ballots to other sites. It is the moment where I stack up all the projects I cherish the most, try to shine one more light before the year closes off. And this past year, it feels like more of one than most. And one on some level, it kind of feels like I failed. Now, that might sound kind of wild to some people. I still covered over 200 albums in 2022. Plenty of them were great. I had no trouble finding 50 to make this list and still having to make some tough cuts. And without the ratings in 2022, it's all the more ambiguous what could actually make this list, to say nothing of the order in which they might arrive. And hell, everyone was going on about how there was so much great music in 2022. And yeah, that was true. There was a lot of great music, but finding the transcendent stuff, the stuff that wowed me, went over the top, felt a lot harder. Now, I've accepted that some of this comes with being a critic and just getting exposed to so much more that it becomes a lot harder to wow me in today's day and age, but I'm not really sure I'm willing to accept that as an excuse. Besides the albums that did get a ton of acclaim that just didn't hit as strongly for all sorts of stupid reasons, this was also the year of artists who actually took that little bit of extra time over the past couple of years to build a lot more layered and complicated projects that were clearly trying to do more, where reviewing them was more of a challenge, and they kind of wound up hit and miss as well. And more to the point, I didn't feel as exploratory as I normally feel with albums when I had the time to go on Bandcamp deep dives. Kind of odd because in 2022, there were more artists than ever before who came out of nowhere for me, but fewer that I had the pleasure of actually finding on my own because I just got so quickly overwhelmed right out of the gate with records in 2022. I never really had the proper time to dig myself out of my backlog. But you know what? Musing on future plans, that's for the update video for 2023 ahead. It's going to be coming out soon. But for now, we do have a pretty eclectic list here, which is always a friendly reminder for as much as I am disappointed with myself not really venturing out of my comfort zone, this is still a far stranger selection of records than many, mainstream or otherwise, will acknowledge. There may be a preponderance of rap and country on the list. By now, that should not be a surprise. But I was kind of shocked just how many strange places this list took me. In a bizarre way, it might be one of my most oddball lists to date, both in terms of the selections and the placement. Fair warning, I guarantee a bunch of you did not hear everything on this list. There will likely be some surprises that fly in your face of your picks. So let's blaze through the first 25 relatively quickly.
I'm so grateful to be alive, but alive ain't always living. Sometimes niggas just survive day to day. Plate to plate, 2 piece and fries, or the steak with leaves on sides, sometimes low and sometimes high.
Well, he did say that if he didn't make one of these lists every year, he'd be on someone's project who did, and in 2022, Quelle Chris was right on both counts. Now, I'll admit Deathfame is not an album I revisit all that often amidst the wealth of indie rap we got in 2022. It's a heavier, downbeat, miasmic listen full of gallows humor and dark drifting thoughts, all on contextualizing success in a hip-hop world where death becomes so thoroughly commodified. But it is one that fits its purpose so effectively with so much wit in the bars and so much texture in the production. It deserves some recognition all the same.
Turn off the record if you think I'm getting better. I don't wanna let you down. I don't wanna let you down.
This is also an album that didn't always get a ton of play for me, despite how shimmering and relaxed it ultimately was. Maybe it was struggling to find those individual standout cuts that had the layered gut punch of Carolyn Spence's best. But the funny thing is that it did have a number of excellent dream country songs that pulled me in with a lot of her sweet delivery, the softly layered production, the gorgeous melodies, and her settled arc of self-care and rejuvenation. Again, this was one that really worked in the right place in the right time, and hell, Mary Oliver nudged it alone up onto this list. Great stuff.
Beyond the horizon, I'll follow where love has gone. Twilight finds me here alone.
This is probably probably lower than some folks might expect, given how much of a fan I am of this group. Poets of the Fall making a return to the sinuous, liquid smooth alternative rock and metal that easily put me in mind of Temple of Thought, albeit with more of a self-referential spin to the writing, in trying to chase the Ghostlights in their art and performance. But then again, when you have that sort of easy comparison, the formula didn't quite have as much replay value as I was expecting, which is why it did kind of slide back for me. A terrific performance that occasionally felt a bit fleeting, and that we have heard it before. But still, the formula works. Poets of the Fall made some wondrous music. This band still needs a lot more attention.
It breaks my heart to think about we will never be the same again. Here I've been so trying to figure me out when I should have been worried about them.
The latest addition to this list, and one where I kind of struggled to place it, partially because it does feel like a bit of a step down from his 2020 breakthrough that I frankly should have covered a couple of years ago. Still, this is the sort of textured indie country and southern rock with a lot of homespun, very direct writing that makes every song feel a little bit timeless, with weathered but well-balanced production and enough sizzling bluesy heft to kick some ass at its best moments. And Arlo McKinley proved that he could be a force to be reckoned with. Another one that's been slept on. Check it out. And speaking of forces to be reckoned with, this was a grisly, gore-soaked surprise, blending in its insanely tuneful and J-rock inspired guitars with black metal viscera, and it made for a tight but effectively delivered slice with some polish and potential going forward. Yeah, the grooves could be a little bit stronger, more robust, and there is some tonal whiplash between the tunes and some of the graphic content, but Saidan's tortured but kinetic rapture was truly a sight to behold, and way catchier than it had any right to be. Good stuff. And on the topic of being way catchier than I expected, Actor Observer made a very lean but fiercely intelligent and forward-thinking slice of post-hardcore and metalcore that not only nailed the big hooks and the La Dispute-esque atmosphere, but also the sort of self-reflective dissections that have the desperate urgency of feeling just as trapped within toxic systems that come with late capitalism and machismo, of which they very much live, but also coming with the expectations that they're going to be the ones that will break forth, light those fires. I enjoyed and revisited this way more than I thought I would. Definitely deserves more attention, especially in subgenres that aren't always my thing.
Take it or leave it. It is what it is. They call me the hometown kid. Since I've been around.
Now, this is absolutely a case of high expectations having me come down pretty hard on a project that I ultimately thought is still pretty damn great. I love Gabe Lee's 2020 album Honkytonk Hell for the cavalier swagger and charm and incredible vibrancy, so a more reflective, settled album did feel like a bit of a swerve, but you know what, the homespun Americana, the pensive reflections on slowing down, and absolutely superb production made it a home that's incredibly easy to wander into. Absolutely a comfort album in indie country, but a really damn great and underrated one. You should hear it.
Charge 40 keys a feature now. Eighth development gate got me seeing sound. Afro sheen gleaming beneath my nigga's crown. Aphrodite revealing pieces and secrets found. The beeper beeping like it's linked to the cloud. Now we see Latifah amount.
And here's another late entry, and one that I was on the fence about for a little while. For as impressively smart and creative as Silkmoney is in his bars, especially in how he processes and rages against the commodification and consumption of black art and black lives, this is also a wildly uneven listen where his self-aware impulses are as much his greatest weakness as they are his greatest strength. And yet, it felt way too goddamn thought-provoking for me to ignore it, and I kept going back into that nightmare. I mean, you can clearly tell this is not built to last. I'm gonna savor the moments that we got.
And I know I can take it like a man. I know I can take it like a man.
Ah yes, I've been waiting to pull a full-length Amanda Shires album on one of my lists for years now. And she just so happens to get there with what many are considering a proper breakthrough, and a harrowing one at that, offering the other side of the lens to a very conflicted relationship with her husband, Jason Isbell, where a lot of the newfound context is all the more heartbreaking. I mean, if it wasn't for some dicey production choices and the occasional moment of theatricality that did not quite work, this would be even higher. It's a smoky gut punch of a project that really deserves a flagship spot in and of itself.
Feels like eternity. The world feels like eternity. And what might overpower me? Head down, don't look up, background alone.
Of all the pandemic albums on this list, and there are a bunch for better or for worse, so the open question of how they'll age is out there, this is one where erupting out of that storm, despite all odds, has left the band feeling poised and reinvigorated in a way I did not expect. Now, Metric won me back in 2018 with Art of Doubt, and I'll admit this one didn't quite stick as strongly. The more sprawling compositions looking towards electronic music certainly was a swerve, but when the grooves and the socio-political commentary felt rock solid with the hooks as great as ever, I appreciated at least someone with broader utopian dreams and the plan to get there. So this was the comeback that came out of goddamn nowhere, and that I also didn't nearly expect to like as much as I did. A more progressive pivot from their genre-blurring post-hardcore roots, while maintaining a lot of their tuneful intensity, and then pulling in production from Kurt Ballou of Converge, but also an album that seems to recognize the sad joke of chasing that comeback better than anyone else. I mean, it's losers all the way down, from the blinkered audience who is just going to ceaselessly consume, to the bitter necessity of providing that consumption because you need to eat as well. It's a bleak listen, but one that wound up sticking deep. I cherished this gospel. And on the topic of the ruinous extent of late capitalism, we go from Complicit to the enraged, slow-burning Rebellion, and Soul Glow's best album to date. An insanely frenetic and dense fusion of hardcore punk, hip-hop, and jazz that on plenty of occasions comes across like a shot of far-left online discourse to the base of the spine, for better and for worse. Running on manic adrenaline, and it does translate to some populist missteps, but when it bangs so goddamn hard with so much to pull out of it, even in the wreckage of the mess in its wake, it's compelling.
I confess, I'm a mess, I'm a dog, I'm a pest, I need help, I'm possessed, I need cess, I need cess, I should gather all my demons, I feel blessed, for no reason, I feel blessed, Lord forgive me, I feel blessed, Lord forgive me.
The conclusion of Backxwash's trilogy began in 2020, and arguably her most dense project to date, tapping into the roots of dogmatic religious hypocrisy and anti-black racism to rip them free and begin a personal journey of renewal. Oh yeah, and it bangs like you would not believe, with her most dense and boundary-pushing production in industrial noise and trap metal to date. It also lands on a really nice optimistic note after a project that seemed only to promise immolation. I gotta wonder where she takes us from here. I'm excited.
Signs of intelligent life, mosquito nets repel anaphylus bites. Look at the night, nice, we look alike. They want a slice of your dreams. Even Christ took a knife for the team, so swing.
Lupe Fiasco writes an album in 72 hours, and it winds up more thought-provoking than peers that will take years for their projects, albeit leaving some ideas on the table that could have been explored a little bit further. But still, the jazz rap production is the most laid-back and comfortable he's sounded in over a decade. The elder samurai of hip-hop is pensive, deconstructive, and yet finding the perfect moments to cut loose, where every layered bar feels all the more natural coming from him. Probably the most that I've returned to a Lupe Fiasco album since Tetsuo and Youth. Great stuff. Okay, yes, it might be a formula that's consistently worked for me, but it's a great one. And Emotional Oranges seem keenly aware that their throwback R&B grooves and tangled emotional drama might have a shelf life. And after last year's collab experience, The Juice Box, they've now gone indie and ended their Juice series with a lot of sinuous vibes and sensuality. It is probably the weakest of said series with some iffy mixing, but Emotional Oranges are now set to explore whatever fresh expanse they want. Too many people didn't even realize this dropped. It's worth the listen. So yeah, this was a mid-year staple for me, and very little has changed since then. A time-bending slice of impeccably produced ambient techno, Kelly Lee Owens blending in influences into this weird balancing act of tension and release. An abstract warning tumbling backwards to change and alter our world's path for the better while we still can. It's certainly a strange entry in her catalog. I get why there's a lot of fans who are kinda iffy on this one. It's certainly a swerve, but with such strong and unique production, I can argue it's her best to date. Scintillating stuff. I found this post-punk album on a Bandcamp deep dive very early in 2022, and it makes me wish I had found more of them. The sort of quirky, 90s inflected embrace of bouncy melodic grooves and a lot of tangled irony. Like a lot of the newest wave of post-punk, it reflects the sad states of a lot of folks caught in the wake of capitalism that's crushing them underfoot, but behind all the deflection, there is this core of empathy and observational humor that will temper some of that blow. It's not nearly as nihilistic, recognizing the pettiest of little victories for themselves and for others, while acknowledging they might all wind up getting forgotten in the archives too. It's a little bit beholden to its influences, but still a real treat. Slept on, it's great.
Hanging on the hatred is serious business. The sweetest revenge is forgiveness.
This has fallen back a little for me, and I'm a bit surprised. Jenny Tolman expanding her neo-traditional country formula with a lot of sly workaday observations that remind me of Casey Musgraves, a little bit more verve and sass, but also so many genuinely earnest moments of settling down and trying to fall in love, or at least trying to take the high road that felt genuinely sweet to me. It's definitely more conservative in a lot of its framing, the gentle exasperation of working within frustrating or broken systems rather than seriously challenging them, but you know what? There is so much charm and character in the execution, it's really hard for me to dislike this. It's gonna get slept on by a lot of folks. It's worth hearing.
Picks me up, puts me down. It picks me up, puts me down. Picks me up, puts me down. 100 times a day.
I'll say it, I'm still struggling to call this Florence and the Machine's best album when it comes to sheer pop hooks and wild, socially charged swings with a morally ambiguous feminist fervor. This is certainly the most anthemic that the band has ever delivered. Jack Antonoff's production is more skeletal and brittle, and I do have questions there, but Florence Welch can command it with these huge hooks and a real populist flair that, yes, might also feel a bit beholden to her influences, but rarely to the album's detriment. It's that desperate head rush that goes a little bit too hard that's always been the band's secret weapon, and this is probably one of their best examples of the date. So much fun.
Imaginary players aiming coach right. Master recipes under stove lights. The number on this jersey is the quote price. You order Diet Coke, that's a joke, right?
Yeah, there's a part of me that's a little bit regretful this isn't higher on my list. I had a couple reservations with It's Almost Dry in comparison with Pusha T's last two albums at the mid-year, and unfortunately some of those only became more pronounced as his former label boss, who shows up on this project as a producer and guest rapper, proceeded to immolate his reputation. No, he does not go all the way there with it here, but when you recognize the underlying conservative subtext and how Pusha T sees this brutal world and the deals with the devil that he's made to ascend within it. I mean, it's context that becomes kind of difficult to ignore in the broader scope of things, but still, with impressively menacing production and grimy bars, if there was an album that was made for heavy lifting in 2022, it was this one.
Break the wings off my back, I won't fly away. Nigga, what's the deal? I got time today. I can see the light, it's a mile away. It's a mile, it's a mile, it's a mile.
Whereas the heft of this project caught me off guard in the best way possible, and Red Veil proved that there was a lane for me to access some of the downbeat, lo-fi textures of a lot of this wave and his peers, with thoughtful bars and some incredible production. It's melodically playful and loose, and shows an aspirational framing that's not beholden to all the established existing systems, though they are a weight that he's conscious of carrying. A thoughtful project that can still pick up the swell and yearn for its freedom. I was legit shocked how much this one resonated for me all year, and even if I was, again, late to it, it was a dive worth taking.
Rogers kids, someone that loose into the world, waiting for someone to explain the rules.
I mean, come on, I did expect this project would probably fade a bit on me throughout the course of 2022, and I wound up quite correct in that assessment. Frank Turner's Pandemic record, where there was absolutely catharsis in seeing him return to hardcore punk, full of all sorts of callbacks to his earlier albums, and his most emotionally messy and complex album to date. But the more steps I took away from that mess, the more it got kinda tougher to ignore some flaws. I mean, it still goes off, and has some defiantly poignant moments ripping out online pedantic moral hypocrisy, and Turner does end the album in a better place, so you know what, even if it might age kinda rough, it hits where it needs to in the end. Hit the pit.
I take car insurance price and flick my wrist. Now that's a poetic device. Crack my knuckles and the homage is trite. My confidence implies hype. A letter to the force guiding my hands. Transmissions to the tiny lamp.
I'm frankly baffled as to why this did not get more attention. Rap Ferreira keeps dropping projects that are loose and jazzy and impressively groove-driven, but no less intelligent or insightful, and this might be one of his best to date. And I don't think anyone realized or cared that it came out at all. Yeah, it's relatively short to be sure, but it's probably the album that showcases some of the most wisdom in its self-aware, sidestepping exploitation to chart new paths. At least for me, this was one of the easiest indie rap albums to revisit all year. Just genuinely terrific stuff. And speaking of albums that deserve way more acclaim because bizarrely nobody seemed to be listening, Tegan and Sara took a wild swing towards their earliest and weirdest of their electronic roots and brought in some traces of hyperpop, and with a rock-solid compositional instincts, great production, and a lot of robust queer subtext and themes in between Arrested Development and aging within that scene, this should have received way more acclaim than it did. I mean, it's kind of bizarre that after all the pop albums that got so much popularity, Tegan and Sara are freely now making some of the best pop of their careers. It deserves a lot more attention. And oh god, I really wanted this to be among the top tier of albums in 2022. And yes, it is still great. Sayori's got a formula that's got so much baseline appeal and blending in Celtic folk and black metal with these soaring anthemic melodies and an often underrated lyrical focus. But in an attempt to further diversify their sound, they kind of stretched that fusion and thus was without some of the staying power I was really hoping to hear. Still, Sayori is a force to be reckoned with. This album feels like a storm on the mountains, and with melodies this strong, I don't know, I kept going back. Alright, we are now halfway through. I don't think most of this list has been that surprising, but we're now on to the meatier entries where I will of course have a little bit more to say. Get your drinks, your plants, and your partners of choice, settle on in, and let's get started with number 25. I feel a little bit weird talking about how much I like this album, mostly because this is the first time the band has really got me on board, and I've heard to some this actually feels like a downgrade. But you know, when you're moving on sounds this sweet... Muna's self-titled comes after getting off of the major labels, getting free of a relationship, and then free to find new love, and it's their most sparkling and joyous project in their catalog. Full of a lot of glittery and jagged throwbacks to the late 90s and the 2000s, but the project doesn't feel intentionally retro so much as the sound palette of newfound confidence and inner poise of someone of their generation. I mean, they still got issues and frustrations, but they've actually grown up a little. They're handling them a little better, stacking up the sort of love songs that are a bit more adult in content, but are still fashioned in that old-fashioned yearning. I mean, it's a project with so much momentum, so much flair, and while some were probably hoping for a little bit more of the sad girl vibes, I really appreciated a project that was looking forward, made finding that new path so invigorating. Number 24. It's going to be very interesting to look back on 2022 and notice which critics included the breakthrough from Zach Bryan, American Heartbreak, on their list, which those in the know are hailing as an indie country singer-songwriter masterpiece, and if his commercial appeal keeps growing, and I think it will, I can imagine some critics will surreptitiously claim to have been on the bandwagon the entire time. Now, American Heartbreak is not on my list. This is.
It's a motorcycle drive-by, baby giant condos. I think it's about time we headed home. Walking on this Tyrone with my damn high hopes. Country boys don't die alone.
I mean, look, you can argue that one of the best albums of 2022 is contained within American Heartbreak. The problem is that it's 34 songs and 2 hours long, and for every great track, there's one I would call hit and miss. Ironically, his more focused EP, Summertime Blues, which happens to be longer than albums on this list, it wound up working way more effectively for me. It plays to his hangdog, rough-edged formula of storytelling, but the production palette is a lot more burnished and warm, leaving a little bit heavier on the countryside, especially in the fiddle, and often better for it. Now, brevity and focus is the real strength here, and while many likely see this as the tacked on extra, it might wind up sticking around a little longer. At least for me. This was a lot of fun. Number 23. I'm starting to realize I might like Billy Woods more as a solo act than with Arm & Hammer. Separated from Elucid, his style of writing gets more space to tangle, but also showcase a different brand of challenging complexity. Less defiant, thorny abstraction, more just the textured picture of the world that will really challenge you in its reality. And here, this might be one of his most complicated albums to date.
Money went, same as it came. Money spent, it was all pocket change. End of the day traders make minimum wage. Pennies on the dollar once it's all said and paid. Penny stocking cap pulled over the face.
This project has gotten a lot of acclaim in hip-hop circles as one of the most dense and challenging projects released in 2022, where it almost feels like you could write term papers on all the interconnected ideas and samples and thematic touchpoints, interweaving a lot of entrenched systems and cycles of power amidst this swampy, intensely textured, quasi-surreal trudge through a lot of lingering frustration and fear and boredom and isolation through the power that you yourself have amassed. It does feel like the natural extension of 2021's Haram by Arm & Hammer, but inflated to a global scale, where Billy Woods will take you through that jungle with the expectation you probably won't keep up, but if you can, you'll find some of the most challenging and rewarding bars and revelations in rap this year. It's truly worthy of all that critical attention. It's worth diving in. Number 22. But this is the better Billy Woods album.
This thing was broke from the jump. No point going back and forth over who did what. My character arc rolling loud to Shakespeare in the park and get stabbed. Stagger off in the dark. I'm waiting in the wings, understudy every part.
Yeah, a bit of a swerve with this one. For the first time, I understood how folks who like terror management over hiding places felt in 2019, because it's a similar tonal dichotomy. The earthly, complex project juxtaposed with one that feels more diffuse and scattered, this time courtesy of Messiah Music on production. But the difference here is just how much Church is nestled in a very personal narrative that really comes together. The element of Woods' writing that's often feels so ignored for the high concept themes and the wonder of his abstract rapping. But even if the scenes feel more abstract and blanketed in weed smoke and weird humor, you get a lot more insight into Billy Woods as a man and the very real heartbreak that lingers on this project, the personal failures and foibles that'll shape his beliefs and his experiences and thus deepen them all the further. I mean, I saw Billy Woods touring for church this year, and maybe it was some of those live moments extrapolated here that helped them pick up more power, but at least to me, I think I would put this among his best. Number 21. This is higher on my list than I expected. I'm not going to say it grew on me so much as it didn't shrink. It just held up as so potent and solid and consistently striking that even if this band will never be the same or last at all, we still got this.
And you, like Concord, I came, a gentle hill racer, I was breathless upon every mountain.
I'll be honest, I'm a little bit surprised Black Country New Road is actually continuing after the departure of Isaac Wood, given how much his idiosyncratic sense of structured theatricality and howling melodramatic dorkiness is at the roots of this album. No wonder the internet adores it. Now, while I could highlight the grand tumbling sweep of the vintage jazz and the show tunes-esque inflected compositions with the slint worship that they will never escape, or all the metatext of Wood's relationship to the band that has underscored their entire career, or the reality that by the end of the album it kind of necessarily implodes as if he saw it coming. And I do kind of wish there was a better payoff, but there is this yearning melodic charm and experimentation that cuts through all the artifice and hits something genuinely real, made all the more precious by the reality we're not really going to get anything more quite like this. Unfortunately, I wasn't all that impressed by Jockstrap's breakthrough this year, so whatever form members of this group take in the future might be up to debate, but damn, what a way to go out. Number 20. But on the topic of sophomore albums full of retro throwback touches where the romantic scope can be truly breathtaking, this was the year I was introduced to Hatchie, and I already feel that I was way too late to this party. Taking the touches of Britpop-inflected shoegaze and then blowing it up to a new height. Definitely wearing its influences on its sleeve, to be sure, but when the compositions soar with so much power and presence, with so much more expansive production, it's really hard for me to care. An album chock full of complicated, love-struck moments that, like with Muna, make them feel huge and poignant, where even if it was all so flighty, it feels so much bigger. Hatchie's sophomore project propelled her to new heights this year. I frankly can't wait to see where she'll go flying next. Number 19. There were two ways that this album could have proceeded after the underwhelming success of this artist's album in 2020. Most likely driven off the label shift, but nobody with executive power ever takes blame for when an album underperforms when it's the best of the artist's career thus far. No. This could have become a sharp course correction to the old form to get back to the hits, or a double down on the more flavorful side of that last, let's call it, transitional album. In a strange way, I think Brett Eldredge did both.
Caught a scent of your perfume when I heard dancing in the dark. Now I'm just trying to get through. These songs about you.
Not gonna lie, this album was gonna make my list on Brett Eldredge's charm and natural charisma alone. The guy is insanely likable, even if his tones aren't really a natural fit for whatever the hell Nashville wants any given week. And while I wasn't consistently a fan of bringing in Music Row ringers for production, this isn't better than Sunday Drive. Eldredge's compositions go straight into country soul, and he's a natural fit. He's always been that vintage showman type, but now he's got the chance to really expand upon that territory, writing with more nuanced love and breakup songs that allow him to play a more intriguing and varied character. A lot of the bros and boyfriend country dudes in Nashville, they don't have much of a personality because honestly, they don't really need it. Whereas Brett Eldredge has all manner of personality, and while it doesn't always hit, he's finally found a lane that brings forth so many rich rewards, except that this sold even worse than Sunday Drive. I mean, come on, someone get this guy his promo team back from Atlantic Nashville. Music this great deserves to be heard. Number 18. Of the artists on this list, this guy's probably the least surprising. He's made my year-end list damn near every time he's released an album, and while I don't quite love this as much as his frankly ridiculous run of quality in the 2010s, it's still worth your consideration.
Burn whatever it was, what it was. Dream was hung from a tree, See the monster in me, see the monster, see the monster in me, see the monster.
Of all the pandemic albums on this list that actually get to the roots of the psychological damage sustained over the course of years that some are only now beginning to reckon with, Open Mike Eagle frankly unseated Frank Turner for me because he was willing to go deeper. He was attempting to contextualize the losses that he's felt with a sort of brutal, self-aware career re-examination that we rarely hear this honest on record. I mean, Anime Trauma and Divorce was ground level in 2020, by far his most emotionally messy album, but this is more scattered but measured, trying to reassemble the pieces even if he's not sure he can, returning to his roots, but even there, loss has been felt. Rappers will die of natural causes, after all. And he even has to reckon with his, let's call it, complicated relationship with the fandom, which as a creator myself, it felt way too relatable, and it's probably his most difficult album in about a decade. But again, when there's such a high floor of layered bars and content, and excellent guest performances, and a genuine emotive arc across the album, this became a tape I burned through so many times. Number 17. This was the first truly great album I heard in 2022. I'm kind of stunned it lasted all year for me, but it's their best work to date. FKA Twigs pulled it off.
I could be with anyone. I'm pussy like a pussycat. You're the only one I want. Give love and then you take it back. All the kisses, all the fun. I hate it when you give me half. Never give me half.
I know it's going to be contentious that me saying this is better than LP1 or Magdalene, but for me it's not even particularly close. It's looser, more textured, more lived in. Two albums in a row that have the mixtape feel where the words of old technology are signifiers of a more intimate experience, and shedding a lot of the art house pageantry helps FKA Twigs' breathtaking voice and icy production take a more accessible form, showcasing rock-solid compositional instincts that were previously feeling a bit stifled. This was an album that I played in every season and it never got old. The sort of forward-thinking R&B where the pretensions towards refinement are balanced out with real humanity. The individual songs and hooks are better. The production might be rougher, but that contributes to its charm, and the writing is as emotionally vibrant as ever. Top quality stuff, one of the best of the year, deserves not to be forgotten. Number 16. You probably missed this album in 2022. Honestly, can't blame you. It's the sort of project that even among the music nerds, you'd be hard-pressed to find folks that have heard about it, or given the mysterious artist behind a lot of it demands a lot of attention. That changes now. The odd thing with Spunkshine is that his material feels contemporary to the times, but also like someone excavated that present from a different timeline altogether, where it's familiar, but ever so slightly askew, where he could use that alien ambient texture to intimidate or alienate the audience, but here he chooses something kinda different, more playful and embracing all the absurd. This is an album that sees a lot of incomprehensible truths that humanity wants to ignore, before throwing up the double bird and bouncing through it with some insanely well-textured melodic grooves pulling from IDM and even house. It kind of feels like you're getting tricked, but also like you're in on the joke, so you don't really care. And it's a weird way to describe a sprawling electronic project from a relative unknown, but it's also probably the most fun I've had with an electronic album in years. It's utterly unique, so flavorful, and if you buy the bonus cuts on Bandcamp, you'll hear the best bass line of 2022 hands down, and it's very deserving of real attention. Should you go dig it up. Number 15. But speaking of overlong, slightly obtuse, but deeply enjoyable projects that border on the slightly silly,
I see ghosts, specters light around me, living in the dark, blaze in the dark. One by one, pictures gather around me, where those moonflowers used to.
Okay, I would struggle to put this among Avantasia's best. Tobias Sammet has set a pretty damn high bar over the decades, and Ghostlight does cast a long shadow, especially with its thematic depth, with as a continuation of the ideas of Moonglow, this album can't quite hit. But what it does have is refinement, taking a little bit more extra time to further burnish and flesh out the compositions, flirting with symphonic and power metal with another stacked array of guests, and Tobias Sammet pulls together some of his best hooks in years too, to make what might be one of the best slices of musical theater I heard all goddamn year. Now this is where I normally attach all the disclaimers that come with putting symphonic or power metal on my list. A lot of people don't take it seriously, but frankly I'm done with that. If you can't get behind the insane hooks, the incredible performances, and the gloriously anthemic moments, that's your loss. This ruled. Number 14. And funnily enough, speaking of musical theater, or at least something adjacent to it,
Small town women ain't built to get along, but you burn one bar, you burn us all. We'll be here drinking till the smoke is gone.
I'll freely admit this was one that took a long time to really click for me. The best songs kept it in my rotation as some of the best country of 2022, but there were questions I couldn't really escape with this album. The production and some of the writing felt a bit broadly sketched. The album felt more like a snapshot of a place rather than having any sort of overarching plot or deeper sense of drama, and there simply wasn't as much Ashley McBryde herself on the album as you might expect. But eventually I realized that was kind of the point. Lindenville functions as a similar vein as Our Town, a universal lived-in standard full of eclectic characters, but ones that feel familiar for those rough small towns, and the real humanity that they cling to, with McBryde both narrator and character herself in that story. But at the end of the day, it's insanely vibrant, legit funny, and heartfelt, and ambitious as all hell, even if you can tell Music Row had no goddamn idea how to market it. Damn shame. Does this town worth a visit? Number 13. Do I want to go out on a limb and say this is Taylor Swift's best album since Speak Now? Or should I just say it's her best album, period?
It's me, hi, I'm the problem, it's me. At tea time, everybody agrees. I'll stare directly at the sun, but never in the mirror. It must be exhausting, always rooting for the anti-hero.
There's a part of me that's still kind of floored by just how much I connected with Midnight's, and all the more stunned that it actually had major commercial success as well, given that with its subject matter, morally ambiguous framing, and deeply messy approach to how Swift handles her power when beset by those who want to control it and her on all sides. This is hearing the seeds of Reputation finally bear fruit against the chill, pulsating synths from Jack Antonoff, who allows the proper space for her thoughts to wander, but also the crisp foundation for her most emotionally conflicted delivery to date that back up the writing that is painfully self-aware of all the lonely costs that she's had to pay to get to this point where every opulent deflection only prevents that deeper connection of which she craves. It's easily an album that could have been crushed beneath the weight of its recursive self-importance, look at Reputation, but it's now framed properly to make a more complicated portrait. And hell, when the songs are this tight and the melodies just shimmer, maybe Swift has just enough to look towards fresh dawn. Number 12. Now, you see, Taylor Swift understands her power, the glamours that come with it, but sometimes you can't just own all of it. Sometimes it's all just too much. Sometimes you throw up all sorts of abstract, off-kilter walls in an embrace of pop artifice that may be seen as a betrayal, but also wind up your best as well.
'Cause you can bend, you can slide, you can push me to my limit, you can run, you can crush every blue boy on the planet, or in love with the future. I don't know why, or in love with the future. I don't know why.
This was the album where I think I finally clicked for everything, and to some it is an outright betrayal of the progressive art rock they once made in favor of alternative dance music? But I'm sorry, this does not feel like a betrayal to me. Not only are they able to tap into compositional instincts that allow them so much flair, so much fun, the sort that comes when progressive rock bands try to write pop music and they prove shockingly good at it, especially when they're able to explore, it becomes a timely thematic extension of what they were exploring their past two albums, only this time with a populist framing for the deflection of trauma, the reason why folks sink into the shallow hedonism or the obfuscation of the internet and technology, and it's a vibrant and a wildly textured ride that does try to find connection beyond all the absurd waves, but said absurdity is often just as fun to experience in its own right with its riotous intensity and their best ever hooks. I went back to this album so much in 2022, found more to like about it every time. If this is what being in love with the future sounds like, I get why. Number 11. Of course, there's deflecting from trauma, then there's the reality of facing it head on. And speaking of acts who may have just delivered their best album to date...
Stay up, make up, waste it away. Hold on, I'm gonna make it okay till the morning comes and leaves me dry. I can only try to leave this piece of me behind.
Okay, if Def Havana had a slightly better producer, this could have been my album of the year. The hooks are that tight, the delivery is that raw, the writing is that potent in trying to parse through the living hell this band went through and losing half their lineup and coming to a stark reckoning of whatever possible future might hold, if it's substance abuse that is not abated, a lot of heartbroken angst, and the feeling that they may have just missed their window to really break through. It's easily the most emo of any entry on this list, but the palette of overcompressed, pulse-pounding pop rock that swings for the fences every single time, and more often than not, hits that home run. And I have no idea if this is a culmination will be the last thing that we get from Def Havana. Frankly, from this album, I'm stunned we got anything at all. But you know, if this is how they go out, what a way to go. Number 10. It's odd when something feels like a culmination, but also something so amazingly fresh and new from an artist this many years in. And while the critical reception to this has been kind of a little strange, for me it clicked in a big way. Because this is one of Bjork's best albums in years. I don't know, I think folks may have gotten a little bit used to Bjork making pure magic that their standards get a little bit wonky. So maybe it's just me being cooler on some of her work the past 15 years outside of Volnakura that caused this to have so much resonance for me, but I would argue Fosora feels even further. It's almost kind of feral in how the off-kilter strings and hammering gabber percussion will tumble over itself, but Bjork brings such a yearning vibrancy to her delivery and the exploration of life cycles and especially motherhood, where the sense of time can feel vast, but the intimate connections are all the more resonant within that. There's such a playful, heartfelt character to this album that surrounds so many moments of complicated emotional drama, and while it makes for a sprawling, kind of abstract listen, like all the fungal growths it references, it feels like every root connects to each other. Just a beautifully organic, intensely charming listen. Like every Bjork album, it's not for everyone, but I also call it probably one of her most accessible albums in years. What a blast. Number 9. On the flip side from the constant elevations and experiments within the formula, you've got gentle refinement, although just as conscious of the unceasing flow of time and those caught in its wake.
And all these roads could have swore that they closed, and all these towns would have swore they fell down.
I'm legit shocked that this album seems not to be getting any play outside the indie country circles, because arguably it's a brighter, warmer, more accessible version of Between the Country from 2019. Also one of the best albums of that year. The sort of homespun but endlessly detailed and charming project goes through a lot of wide-angle framing and Ian No's magnetic charisma. But that's also not to deny the intensity of these scenes. No might write from the fringes, and there's a deceptive complexity in how he explores those who are struggling to get by with whatever they can in the Appalachian Highlands, more sympathetic to those who get trod underfoot than the world that's leaving them behind, and stepping away from a lot of the graphic violence of Between the Country, and allows Ian No to showcase a broader range of emotions in a project that's no less crisp, refined, and charming. I mean, someday more folks and critics will get on board. Let's make that sooner rather than later, shall we? Number 8. And on the topic of singer-songwriters that deserve a lot more acclaim for fascinating character portraits driving increasingly warm and accessible themes and writing...
I'm doing this for revenge. I'm doing this to try and stay true. I'm doing this
I think this is the most fun I've had with John Darnielle and the Mountain Goats since Goths. And while it doesn't quite hit the insane resonance and highs that album did, his exploration and deconstruction of action cinema, its tropes, and the trappings of machismo around it, while still kicking a ton of ass, it is a marvel to behold. And while I could go on about just how well John Darnielle explores all these masculine archetypes all over this album, with the sort of framing that can showcase the very real human consequences, both external and internal, it's also delivered through the most loose and outright fun slice of groove-driven indie rock that this band has had in years. This is an album that burns to be heard live, with a free-flowing, jamming intensity that can only really come from skilled veterans who are carrying out their mission. I mean, I'd call this one an absolute win, no matter who makes it home. Number 7. So if you saw my full-length review of Renaissance by Beyonce, you won't be surprised to know that it's not on this list. If you're surprised by that, given how prevalent it was on nearly every other critic's list, well, I can point to the review, but if you don't want to go through that range of discourse again, here's my alternative. I mean, I knew Special Interests had a ton of potential with their breakout project in 2020, but this is a leap of deceptive accessibility I did not expect, but effectively delivered everything a lot of folks got from Beyonce. A distinctly black and also queer voice embracing the traditions of vintage house for some of the catchiest and most dance-ready cuts to date, but also for an audience that understands the radical politics that was often coached around that era and feels just as relevant and immediate now, which is when this album makes a hard swerve in a noise and post-punk, and it reminds me of all this Possible Savages albums that we did not get. It's fiercely intelligent and self-critical, but it's also anthemic and riotous and fun, just to the point when it can swivel into something far darker and less fun. I don't know, I prefer instead of a renaissance, a reformation. Number 6. And speaking of critically beloved albums that are not on this list, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers by Kendrick Lamar. I already went over my lengthy and complicated issues with that project and the production and content and themes in my 40-plus minute review of that thing. I mean, it's a fascinating album, but it's not one I would hold up as a whole among the best of this year. Mostly because, for all of its complexity, I already had something that did it better.
As I keep on walking, ain't no stopping in this dirty, filthy, rotten, nasty little world we call a home. They get Mickey's popping, ain't no option for my partners, so they resort to scams and robbing. Take away stress, we ganja copping, blow it all out, it's all forgotten.
This is Denzel Curry's best album since the Imperial tape, and one that shows so much growth and maturity. I'm still kinda stunned how much of a leap it feels. The biggest leap comes in the meditative, texture, kind of off-the-wall production pivots, leaning more into liquid jazz textures and experimentation that nevertheless remained catchy and anthemic and bombastic when it needed to be. But more importantly, it came with Denzel Curry accepting a meatier role and responsibility within modern hip-hop, taking that sort of harrowing self-care journey but coming out darker for it on the other side, also shouldering some of that heavier responsibility as well. I mean, Denzel Curry has always been fiercely intelligent, but this is the moment where his self-awareness and wisdom feels a lot more magnified and potent. Now, coupled with every single guest star delivering in spades, this is a strident and unique rap record that leaves me thrilled for whatever might come next. I really want to see this future ahead. Number 5. If there was an album that just bulldozed all of my expectations, a cinematic debut for the ages, that for once it appears like all the critics and audiences got on board, I mean, I'm a little bit shocked it's this one. I sure as hell am not complaining. I'll say it again. This is a star-making debut, and I don't say that lightly. The sort of album with the scale and scope and imagination and yearning passion that puts it in a tier all by itself, sweeping up fandom's yearning for that heart-rending power, both figuratively and also somewhat literally. And yeah, I was kind of thrown off by some bad coverage of this initially, but man, Ethel Cain won me over first with Preacher's Daughter and its gargantuan, crushing depth, spanning religion and gender norms in Southern Gothic Americana, and then when I saw her live this year, and how she effectively sounds the same as on record, it's marvelous, carrying a balance of shimmering, gorgeously produced pop alongside slowcore, alternative country, and Americana, and also the stuff of Nightmares, is a sort of opening to a trilogy that leaves you wondering what newfound ecstasy might be gleaned. Call it sacrilege, call it heresy. Best debut of 2022, bar none. Number 4. Whereas if I'm looking for the biggest leap an artist took, propelling from some gothic tones of his own to something burlier, a little bit more burnished swing and flair.
And I hate to say, I spent it all on masquerades. On the night, I'd forgotten how it goes. Flash a smile while the traffic's slow.
Orville Peck's Bronco is a sort of album that should make him a star. Pony got him in the door, but you could tell this gay Canadian cowboy was set to fall within a bit of a niche, whereas this proves him a force to be reckoned with. An expansive blast of textured country and vintage pop, with one of the best voices working in the industry, stacked high with hooks and layered but with a lot of heartfelt swagger. It's a project that paints in broad strokes and yet earns every minute of it. Deeply indebted to the past, but written to feel very contemporary, primed for the future. And yes, part of the reason this is so high on my list is because a solid half of this album became modest karaoke go-to tracks for me, but hey, when it works, I ain't gonna complain. Saddle up, let's ride. Number 3. Okay, there is a part of me that wants to call this a lateral move from their album last year, but that same part of me knows that when the quality is this high and the album's more accessible than ever, and this year has felt like a grand coming out party for them, I shouldn't step on the revelry.
Do you really want to go to heaven when we get this rapture started? Do you want to go to hell, children, with Dean the artist? Gonna dance around on the fire ground, ever gonna fiddle out a bluegrass sound?
God, this album was so goddamn likable. It came out so late in the year, and it drives me kind of crazy that there won't be enough critics who will remember it for year-end lists that conveniently forget December. But you know what? That's their goddamn fault, not a Deem the Artist. The wit, the sense of romance, the keen eye for politics balanced out nimbly with a lot of genuine humanity and impeccable framing, all wrapped into a package that's got their warmest and most charming production and tunes to date that can easily be taken on the road. A Deem the Artist proved just how much they belong in the pedigree of the best singer-songwriters in indie country today. I mean, the America that I want to see going forward has a lot more of this. Let's dream big. Let's make that happen. This was fantastic. Number 2. This is probably not the biggest surprise of 2022 for everyone else, but it might be for me. I was really primed to like this guy back in 2018, and I knew with his run of guest appearances he was getting there, but I wasn't sure we had had that proper moment to put him over the top, well, until now.
Push the fucking pack off of the porch or break a pound down. Get the scrap if it happen to blow, it makes a round sounds. Pussy cat on my lap, push it back and go to town down. Putting rap on my back and I'm black and snatching crowns.
So J.I.D is an absolute superstar, and the fact that the Forever Story didn't catapult him into mainstream acclaim is kind of bewildering to me. He's got the components of what could have been Kendrick Lamar's run looking like in 2011 and 2012, and with the textured percussion, the melodies, the insane flows, and the thought-provoking content to get there, this was his most successful to date. I can argue it should have been even bigger. I'm honestly kind of stunned the critics didn't get more on board with this. It seemed like it was right up their alley, given just how well J.I.D delivered with increasingly thoughtful and introspective wordplay. It's a kingmaker album that doesn't collapse under the weight of its own pretension because of its layered family ties and all the sly challenges to that power structure he's ascending. Oh, suddenly I get why a lot of critics don't like it. It's all amidst a lot of top quality production and the majority of guests who deliver in spades. Hell, I can argue the Forever Story is the best thing Dreamville has ever put out. Yes, that includes every J. Cole album, a formula refined towards transcendence by a talent that finally has the proper architecture to deliver him a masterwork. So what could overtake it? Number 1. I kind of knew from the very beginning there wasn't going to be anything that tops this in 2022. It's not a surprise this is here. But in the year when I discovered this band 5 years too late, they delivered one for the ages.
Come to find me. I'm here today but don't belong. I'm working till the dead is gone. The upside of it, the upside of it. But in a most familiar way, I'm begging you to understand. I try to be a decent man. The upside of it, the upside of it.
Angel in real time, at least to me, it doesn't feel like your stock indie rock record imitating The National or U2 in the grandeur or scope. It doesn't just feel cinematic in its drama, it feels global. A record spanning multiple countries as the frontman grapples with the loss of his father and the very complicated legacy he left behind. If Go Farther in Lightness was the Joshua Tree, this is Achtung Baby, just minus all the irony with more textured and interesting breakbeat percussion that highlights a personal drama that can feel simultaneously intimate and messy and complicated, but also spanning the world. It's an album that in the face of indescribable emotions and loss, you question everything you know, including the mechanism in which you are allowed to question, and then you try to find the way forward. And with every grand, anthemic swell of emotion, the drama feels so earned. Gang of Youths proved they were not just beholden to their influences, and with some of the best production you will hear on record damn near all year, and with a lengthy runtime that somehow never feels bloated, this is an album that earns every descriptor, and yet they can't all capture that moment of transcendence unlike few else this year. It's been a while since my top album of a year also has my top song, but Gang of Youths pulled it off. Best album of 2022. Let's see if 2023 can rise in the wake of its leaving. I don't know, with this, feels a little more possible. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. If you guys have your own list of albums, please drop them in the description below. I'd be fascinated to see where they all come out, because there's some weirdness on this list. I'm curious where your weirdness resides. I also have a channel update that's going to be coming the next video, and then we're back on regular schedule. But speaking of said schedule, if you want to get albums on it for the year ahead, or just argue with me on Discord, or support the channel beyond my merch in the description below, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated. Tough times, I understand. The option's available. Till then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.